17th June 2024. Chinese and Filipino troops clash at sea.
I salute the 80 officers and troops who sailed the waters and exercised the greatest restraint amidst intense provocation. So as we award these medals, we remember that on June the 17th, we made a conscious and deliberate choice to remain in the path of peace.
As tensions in the South China Sea escalate, the focus shifts increasingly to Washington.
Any attack on Philippine aircraft, vessels, or armed forces in the South China Sea would invoke our Mutual Defense Treaty.
Who is responsible for the South China Sea conflict?
确有个别国家在外部势力的煽动下，毁弃双边的约定，违背自身的承诺。
Some in Manila blame China. Others blame the United States. As the situation grows more tense, the Filipino government seeks out other friends, drawing in Japan, Australia, and also deploying missiles from India.
The United States probably want these small countries to poke in China's eyes to make China feeling uncomfortable.
I don't think China wants a conflict. The U.S. certainly doesn't, and neither does the Philippines. But accidents happen.
June 2024. On the eve of the Philippines' Independence Day, hundreds of activists marched towards the Chinese consulate in Manila.
We're celebrating the Philippine Independence Day on its eve here in front of the Chinese consular office. This is our way of celebrating the courage and heroism of Filipinos who fought against occupation by foreign aggressors in the past. And this is also our way of telling China that we have a history of courage against aggressors and we will not be cowed by their present occupation and harassment in the West Philippine Sea.
Tensions have flared between the Philippines and China over the last 2 years in the South China Sea. China claims most of the South China Sea as its traditional fishing grounds. The Philippines rejects these claims and in 2013 filed a lawsuit against China at the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. In 2016, the results of the court's ruling was announced.
International Tribunal says China's 9-dash line in South China Sea has no legal basis.
China does not accept the verdict. Within the last 2 years, there have been several clashes between the two countries. 14th of June 2024, just 2 days after Philippines' Independence Day, another protest erupts outside the Chinese consulate. Protesters denounce new regulations passed by China, which allows its Coast Guard to detain foreign nationals for up to 60 days for trespassing in what China considers its territorial waters in the South China Sea. Some Filipinos were enraged. The Filipino police was called in to maintain order outside the Chinese embassy.
We are here to condemn the fishing ban of China and the order for the Chinese Coast Guard to arrest so-called trespassers in the South China Sea, including the West Philippine Sea. We believe that China is the real trespasser here, and they have no right at all to arrest anyone, especially Filipinos, especially fisherfolk from the Philippines, from fishing in our own waters, in our own exclusive economic zone.
3 days later, the conflict escalates. Footage from the Philippines government shows a Filipino vessel at the center, surrounded by the Chinese Coast Guard. A Chinese soldier in an orange life jacket has an axe. Behind him, another Chinese soldier appears to be holding a knife. The Philippines government says the Chinese Coast Guard sought to block the Filipino vessel on a resupply mission, heading to another Filipino vessel, the Sierra Madre. The incident happened at 2nd Thomas Shoal in the South China Sea. That's the sound of sirens blaring from the Chinese vessels. The Philippines also say Chinese troops deployed tear gas, hurled rocks, and flashed strobe lights. The video also shows a Chinese Coast Guard officer stabbing a long knife into the hull of the boat. The Philippines claims Chinese troops boarded the Philippine boat, smashed equipment, and punctured its rubber hull. The Chinese also took away phones and rifles of Filipino personnel. The clash reportedly left 8 Filipino servicemen injured, including one who lost a thumb. China has a different view on what transpired.
6月17日，菲律宾一艘运补船和2艘快艇，未经中国政府允许，擅自闯入中国南沙群岛仁爱礁附近海域、邻近海域，企图向仁爱礁非法坐滩的军舰运送包括建筑材料在内的物资。中国海警依法对非法的船只采取了必要的管制措施，现场的操作专业、克制、合理、合法。
2 days after the incident, 2 Chinese warships are spotted near an island in the Philippines.
We will not give up an inch, not even a millimeter of our territory to any foreign power. We will continue to defend our territory and exercise sovereign rights thereon as we see fit. We reiterate that we seek neither permission nor consent from anyone in performing our sworn duties in the West Philippine Sea.
6 days after the incident, President Marcos visits the troops to award medals to the officers involved.
I salute the 80 officers and troops who sailed the waters and exercised the greatest restraint amidst intense provocation. You demonstrated to the world that the Filipino spirit is one that is brave, determined, and yet is compassionate. I reassure you that you have the entire nation behind you. So as we award these medals, we remember that on June the 17th, we made a conscious and deliberate choice to remain in the path of peace.
The United States has a mutual defense treaty signed with the Philippines in 1951. This treaty requires both nations to support each other if another party attacks the Philippines or the United States. With increased confrontations with China, many question when this treaty might be invoked.
If by a willful act on a Filipino, not only serviceman, if a Filipino citizen is killed, that is, I think, very, very close to what we define as an act of war, and therefore we will respond accordingly. And our treaty partners, I believe, also hold that same standard.
And I want to be clear, the United States defense commitments to Japan and to the Philippines are ironclad. They're ironclad. As I've said before, any attack on Philippine aircraft, vessels, or armed forces in the South China Sea would invoke our Mutual Defense Treaty.
Soon after the 17th June incident, the USA State Department issued a statement reaffirming that Article 4 of the 1951 United States-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty extends to armed attacks on Philippine Armed Forces public vessels or aircraft, including those of its Coast Guard, anywhere in the South China Sea.
Let's put it more at the level of political elites and politicians in the Philippines. There's been calls to invoke the relevant provisions in the Mutual Defense Treaty. If you look at public opinion, there's also been a lot of public support for the government to ask for help. And I think this is in recognition that the Philippines alone can't totally match China at the moment, given the glaring power asymmetry between the two countries.
How exactly do the elite as well as the public in the Philippines see the United States stepping in?
The public, in one public opinion survey, also believes that the U.S. will have to help in these resupply missions in order to act as somehow a deterrent for continued Chinese incursion. So this survey has revealed almost 9 out of 10 Filipinos wanted U.S. assistance.
There's an understanding from both governments that that could be potentially escalatory, which is why the Marcos administration has been hesitant to call for it. But June 17th suggests that that may no longer be possible. I don't think we're there yet, but if there is another effort and it goes just as badly, and the Philippine government comes to feel that it will not be able to ensure the safety of its personnel without direct U.S. support, then that request for joint patrols or joint escort missions might come. And I think the U.S. more likely than not would say yes.
Senior Colonel Zhou Bo has represented China at many multilateral dialogues.
Are we dangerously close to confrontation between the United States and China in the South China Sea?
For me to answer whether China and the U.S. would come into a conflict, we first of all have to know whether China and the Philippines would come into a conflict. My answer is no. I don't believe there would be a conflict between China and the Philippines, precisely because Chinese military strength is overwhelming. That actually would stop things from moving in that direction, into a conflict. So the Chinese use of a water cannon might be impressive on TV screen, but actually that is a way for China to use deterrence, and more specifically speaking, to avoid using of force. So with this kind of situation going on, I believe more or less we can manage. As I said, we have overwhelming, dominant military strength. I don't believe the United States actually would have a chance to fulfill its treaty obligation with the Filipino.
On the 2nd of July, the Philippines and China agreed to de-escalate tensions over the South China Sea.
I don't think China wants a conflict. The U.S. certainly doesn't, and neither does the Philippines. But accidents happen.
We've known in history that intense military conflict could just be caused by an accident and less a deliberate choice between parties.
Many of the confrontations between China and the Philippines over the last 2 years take place at a site called the Second Thomas Shoal, also known in Chinese as the Ren Ai Jiao in the South China Sea. 22nd August 2023, 2 Philippine boats breach a Chinese Coast Guard blockade to deliver food and other supplies to Filipino forces guarding the Second Thomas Shoal. Reporters are on board the Filipino vessel to record events.
China has a disputable sovereignty over the Nanshan Island. To avoid its population, leave and keep somehow. Otherwise, you will bear full responsibility for all the consequences.
BRP Sindanglan, MRRV 4407.
conducting lawful routine maritime patrol within the Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone. We are proceeding according to our planned route. Request to stay clear from our passage in accordance with the collision regulations. Over.
The Philippine boats are blocked by at least 4 Chinese Coast Guard ships. This standoff lasts about 5 hours, while a U.S. Navy aircraft circles overhead. Two months later, Chinese Coast Guard vessels and Philippine ships collide during a resupply mission to the Second Thomas Shoal. 5th March 2024. The Chinese Coast Guard deploys a water cannon at the Philippines Coast Guard. Pressure from the water cannon shatters the windshield. 4 Filipino crew members were reported to have suffered minor injuries. A few days later, yet another confrontation at the same area. 3 Chinese vessels surround a Philippine vessel, which was delivering supplies to the Sierra Madre yet again. And then in June, the incident involving knives and axes. These are just some examples of events which transpired at the Second Thomas Shoal. Why is the Second Thomas Shoal so significant? And why has there been so much conflict over the resupplies to a ship called Sierra Madre? This is the ship at the center of the conflict, the Sierra Madre, a decrepit vessel of World War II vintage, grounded on the Second Thomas Shoal. This is the ship the Philippines is constantly sending supplies to, which the Chinese are trying to stop. It was deliberately anchored here by the Philippines in 1999 to bolster the country's territorial claims in the disputed South China Sea.
Pag-may-ari natin at kami inatasan dito na magbantay, handa rin kami na ano man ang mangyari sa buhay namin ay natatanggap na namin.
Why is the Second Thomas Shoal so strategic?
On the Philippine side, it's very near the Palawan landmass. And therefore, for example, if China is able to assert physical presence on the Second Thomas Shoal, they'll be very close, around 100 miles from the Philippine mainland of Palawan. On the other hand, for China also, this is quite important because the Second Thomas Shoal belongs to a key sea lane, the Palawan Strait. And therefore, I think being able to control the Second Thomas Shoal would grant China more of a foothold, a maritime foothold in the South China Sea. And therefore, I think, really assert their 10-dash line.
The Sierra Madre has been parked there for 25 years. How was this issue resolved before?
Well, I think there was a kind of a mutual understanding, especially with the Duterte government. So we have been allowing this kind of a provision of daily necessities, like food and water, to those soldiers, because there is a general understanding between China and ASEAN countries that we should resolve all the issues between us peacefully.
So why do you think there has been an escalation over the last 2 years?
I think that is because the ship is become more and more rusted, and the Filipino government has decided to do something to fortify the ship. And this is not something that we would allow, because actually I believe we have been quite kind to them. Otherwise, how can the soldiers stay on the ship for 25 years? In this kind of standoff between a major power and a small country, normally people would have more sympathies toward a small country. But what I have said it is true, and this is something that the Filipino government can hardly deny, So we just want to stop this kind of a situation from becoming worsening.
The Sierra Madre is very old. It could fall apart in a storm. the Chinese accuse the Philippines of smuggling construction materials to the Sierra Madre illegally to reinforce its structure. China says it struck a gentleman's agreement with the previous Philippine administration under Duterte. Under this agreement, the Filipinos would notify the Chinese before they conducted resupply missions, and it would only resupply goods like food and water or personnel for troop rotation.
2021年底，中非双方经密集沟通协商，达成君子协定。菲律宾本届政府初期，双方继续执行君子协定，直到2023年2月，菲方不再遵守。如果菲方真正想缓和南海局势，就应当立即停止向仁爱礁非法坐滩的军舰运送建筑物资，并修建永久设施。
The Philippines says there is no gentleman's agreement. Manila media question whether or not such an agreement has been made.
China and the Philippines have been arguing about this alleged gentleman's agreement since early May. Is it clear now whether or not there is a gentleman's agreement?
At the moment, there's been a denial from every government, with the exception of maybe those who have worked under the Duterte administration. Certain congressional hearings and investigations are looking into this.
As both sides disagree on the presence of a gentleman's agreement, resupply missions to the Sierra Madre are becoming increasingly fraught.
It is not inconceivable that the Sierra Madre could fall apart in the next big storm. What happens then?
That's a big dilemma for the Philippines. If BRP Sierra Madre collapses, then there's a significant decision point for the Philippine government. And there are many scenarios. Among them would be to anchor another ship. Certain suggestions were even including not to wait for it to collapse, but to already build some installations, occupy it, just like what China and other claimants in the South China Sea has done to the features in the South China Sea.
If the ship falls apart, then China can immediately occupy the reef. This is obviously unacceptable to the Philippines. The most likely scenario is what you saw in 1988 between China and Vietnam at Johnson Reef, in which you had a sharp, short naval battle because both China and Vietnam simultaneously tried to reoccupy that feature. No Philippine government could accept the loss of Second Thomas Shoal. So there will be a huge compulsion for any Philippine government to prevent a Chinese occupation. That's far more dangerous than the situation we have now with these resupplies. And I think the Marcos government correctly calculated 2 years ago that even though it would be risky to bring in supplies and shore up the ship, that would ultimately be less risky than the alternative. The U.S. would be just as obligated to defend Filipino personnel and vessels in that scenario as it is now.
Given climate change and how storms are becoming more intense and more frequent, the Sierra Madre could break any day now.
That's right. This is what makes the South China Sea in general, and Second Thomas Shoal in particular, so dangerous. We could all wake up tomorrow to a crisis that none of us saw coming. You know, everybody worries about Taiwan, and we should be worried about Taiwan. But it's very unlikely that a crisis in Taiwan takes us by surprise. We'll see it coming months in advance. The South China Sea, you might not.
I will not allow any attempt by any foreign power to take even 1 square inch of our sovereign territory.
确有个别国家在外部势力的煽动下，毁弃双边的约定，违背自身的承诺，有预谋地挑起事端，制造假象，误导视听。中方对侵权挑衅行政保持了足够的克制，但这也是有限度的。
In May 2024, more than 16,000 U.S. and Filipino troops convened for annual joint military drills called Balikatan, held at various locations in the Philippines. Balikatan is a Tagalog term for shoulder to shoulder. These drills are meant to strengthen bilateral interoperability and trust. And during the exercise, they fired missiles and artillery at an imaginary invasion force. Commanders from both sides stated the exercise was conducted, quote, to prepare for the worst, unquote. Three things stood out at this year's Balikatan. First, the Philippine Coast Guard joined the exercise for the first time. The Coast Guard has been at the forefront of confrontations with China, and according to a Filipino spokesperson, maritime exercises during the Balikatan placed the Coast Guard in scenarios of armed conflict. Second, the drills were staged mainly in two of the most sensitive areas in Asia, the disputed South China Sea and the Bashi Channel off southern Taiwan. The third element of the exercise that stood out was this. When a barrage of high-precision rockets and airstrikes struck a China-made target ship. The ship was blown apart and sunk. This was the culmination of the annual Balikatan exercise, and journalists were invited to watch.
You don't take the field with a new team right before the big game, right? You have quite a few practices, and that's what we're doing here, is getting out into the field and practicing alongside one another so we can learn, how each other operates and how we're going to react to certain scenarios. So hugely important for us.
According to Philippine media, the target ship used in the exercise is the decommissioned Chinese-built tanker BRP Lake Kaliraya. It was donated to the Armed Forces of the Philippines by the Philippine National Oil Corporation in 2014. Earlier, China had registered its concerns over the Balikatan joint military exercise.
中方一贯坚决反对美国为谋求单方面军事优势，在中国的家门口强化前沿部署。美方此举加剧了地区的紧张局势，增加了误解误判风险。菲方应当清醒地认识到美方此举的真实目的，以及迎合美方的严重后果。
As Balikatan continued, Filipinos rallied outside the headquarters of the Armed Forces of the Philippines to protest against the joint military exercises.
US imperialist! #1 terrorist! #1 terrorist! US imperialist! Out now! US troops! Out now!
A different and larger protest outside the U.S. Embassy against the Balikatan exercises turned unruly.
There's been debate in the Philippines about President Marcos's approach to China, and critics of his approach include his own sister, Senator Amy Marcos, as well as former President Duterte. Can you tell us more about this?
The narrative is that the relatively more assertive foreign policy under Marcos is somehow antagonizing China. It's disrupting somehow the cordial and peaceful relationship between the two powers that the previous government has built. And that there's also this narrative that Marcos is allowing the Philippines to be a proxy for the United States, for it to be more involved in this part of the world.
In the Philippines, we have seen recent protests against China. We've also seen recent protests against the United States. Have there been opinion polls on how many people support closer ties with the United States?
One public opinion poll had said that around 79% of the respondents believe that Marcos should seek closer ties with the US, and this will somehow improve the country's national security position.
In April 2024, the U.S. Congress approved a multi-billion-dollar defense assistance package to the Philippines in order to enhance the latter's maritime security capabilities.
The United States has actually got access to 9 military bases in the Philippines. Then we have to ask these questions. What is the use of these bases, right? Because there could be two purposes. One is for the South China Sea issue, another is for Taiwan issue. But if it is for South China Sea issue, everybody can tell that China is not threatening to use force against any ASEAN claimants. So I think the real purpose of the United States is to strengthen its forward military presence along the first chain of islands. And the Philippines happen to be one of the countries along the first chain of islands. So this is what the United States wants most. But then the question is actually for the Filipino government, why would they all of a sudden give 9 military bases to the United States?
Some in Manila would say it is because China is making them feel insecure, which is why they are deepening their military partnership with the US. So what would you say to those people in the Philippines with that point of view?
I won't buy the allegation at all, because if you look at the relationship between China and the Philippines actually has sued China in the International Tribunal, right? Although we do not recognize the ruling, but we actually are very friendly with the Duterte government, for example. We have even provided free ammunitions, rifle, machine guns, to the Filipino government to help them in resolving the rebellion in southern the Philippines. We give all these weapons for free toward them, and you have seldom heard a serious complaint from the Filipino government towards China. Then, when President Marcos came into power, China actually gave him a red carpet welcome. So we hope he would follow more or less friendly policy toward China. But we do not understand why suddenly he would make a U-turn.
The fact is that this is not a U.S.-China dispute. This is a China-Philippines dispute. And as we've heard President Marcos, among others, say over and over and over for the last 2 years, China does not have a right to erase the Philippines from its own dispute, to make it seem that the Philippines lacks agency and decision-making here. The U.S. is standing behind its ally, not in front of it.
In March 2024, it was also announced that U.S. companies will invest more than $1 billion in the Philippines. The investments would be in areas like solar energy, electric vehicles, and digitization. But then, on the 14th of June 2024, news agency Reuters publishes a shocking report. The report states that the U.S. military ran an anti-vax campaign in the Philippines to undermine China's Sinovac vaccine amid the COVID crisis. The report alleges that the purpose of the secret campaign is to counter what the Pentagon perceived as China's growing influence in the Philippines. More than 60,000 people died from COVID-19 in the Philippines. Although China's Sinovac was found to be less effective than the American-led shots by Pfizer and Moderna, all were approved by the World Health Organization. China's Sinovac has also been proven to reduce COVID-19 mortality rates.
I think the response in Washington, or in the U.S. more broadly, for those who have followed the report, has mostly been outrage and disgust. Not quite as much outrage as there is in the Philippines, where there should be great outrage, but considerable outrage and disgust. This campaign, allegedly orchestrated from specific parts of the Pentagon, clearly ran counter to the overarching policies of the US government at the time. I think it's incumbent on this administration and future administrations to put in place guardrails to make sure that this kind of thing can never happen.
Reuters says this influence operation was done through fake social media accounts on multiple platforms to spread fear on China's vaccines. The Reuters investigation also found that the program started under former President Donald Trump and continued months into Joe Biden's presidency. In the East China Sea, China's maritime strategy is rattling its neighbor Japan. Here, there's a long-standing dispute over the Senkaku or Diaoyu Dao group of islands. They are currently controlled by Japan, but China also claims sovereignty. It's an emotive issue within China. In 2012, mass protests against the Japanese spiraled out of control. Protesters burnt Japanese vehicles and beat up people. And though it happened in 2012, the island territorial dispute with Japan continues to be frequently discussed in China. According to recent Japan Coast Guard data, China has been steadily sending more Coast Guard vessels into the disputed islands, prompting Tokyo to increase its own patrols. In 2023, a record 1,287 Chinese vessels operated in the disputed waters on 352 days of the year. In May 2024, Japan said it had spotted Chinese ships near the islands for a record number of consecutive days. This is one of the factors that has led Japan to increase its military spending. In December 2023, Japan's cabinet approved a record 7.95 trillion yen, or $55.9 billion defense budget for fiscal year 2024. That's a 16.5% increase from 2023's budget, and it will go up even more. The aim is to increase military spending every year until it reaches 8.9 trillion yen, or $62.5 billion, in 2027.
I don't understand why Japan would suddenly just increase its defense spending. I know how people talk Taiwan would be the next Ukraine, but there is no evidence of that.
Japan has also been deepening ties with the Philippines. In April, the United States hosted an inaugural trilateral summit with the stated objective of countering China's military assertiveness.
世界が複合的な危機に直面する中、法の支配に基づく自由で開かれた国際秩序の維持強化に向けて、同盟国、同志国との重層的な協力が重要です。
A statement from the White House said that the U.S. and Japan will support Filipino Coast Guard capacity building, and that Japan will provide 17 Coast Guard vessels to the Philippines. The three countries plan to conduct a trilateral military exercise at sea. In response to the 17th June clashes in the South China Sea, Japan's foreign ministry said it was seriously concerned over repeated actions that increase regional tensions.
The Chinese embassy in Tokyo has told the Japanese government it has no right to meddle in South China Sea disputes between Beijing and Manila. Japan had earlier expressed concerns over repeated actions that obstruct freedom of navigation.
2 weeks later, the Japanese defense and foreign ministers arrived in Manila. They signed the Reciprocal Access Agreement, which is a landmark defense deal that allows both nations to hold joint military drills in each other's territories.
Japanese governments for more than a decade now have talked about the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait and the East China Sea all being a single littoral, and that China's behavior in one has clear effects on its behavior everywhere. China has so frightened other states in the region, and particularly the Philippines, that any historical animosities about Tokyo are being forgotten, that another Asian state is welcoming a boots-on-the-ground presence of Japan in their country, because at the end of the day, they view China as the only threat to regional security.
We have to understand that these two countries, Japan and the Philippines, are American allies. Yeah, so they are actually ganging up together, believing that something is going to happen. But maybe it's interesting for you to know that between China, a major power, and a small country called the Philippines, it is the Philippines that has actually used force against the Chinese in 3 different years, in 2000, 2006, and 2013. In the 3 different years, the Filipino Coast Guard killed Chinese fishermen from mainland China and from Taiwan. I talked to a lot of people because this can be easily Googled. Yeah, it seems that very few people seem to remember the fact that it is the Filipino who have used force against the Chinese.
It's not just Japan that's ventured into the choppy waters of the South China Sea. In March 2024, Australia was among several countries to register concerns about China's alleged destabilizing actions. Australian statements about the South China Sea are nothing new, but analysts say this one was unusually explicit in attributing responsibility to China. When President Marcos visited Australia, the Australian government gave him the platform to address Parliament.
For both of us, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea is not an abstract notion or a theoretical question. Freedom of navigation is fundamental to our sovereignty, our prosperity, our security, and our territorial integrity. Our cooperation is an assertion of our national interest and a recognition of our regional responsibility. It reflects our shared understanding that peace depends on more than the presence of the great powers. All of us in the international community, middle powers like our 2 nations, as well as smaller nations, have our part to play in building a more stable, peaceful, and prosperous future.
The challenges that we face may be formidable, but equally formidable is our resolve. We will not yield.
And I commend you for your personal resolve, Mr. President, for you and your country's courage in calling out acts of coercion, and the Philippines' steadfast commitment to international law.
It was also announced that Australia and the Philippines will elevate the bilateral relationship to a strategic partnership and have new platforms for maritime cooperation. India, too, has a role to play in the South China Sea. In April 2024, India delivered the first batch of BrahMos missiles to the Philippines. This is the first time that India has exported cruise attack missiles to a friendly nation. The French also participated in the Balikatan exercises, sailing together with Philippines and U.S. forces through the South China Sea.
中方倡导敞开大门，共谋和平，反对构建排他性的军事同盟。针对各种他国的小圈子，不会让地区更安全，只会让局势更紧张。
What the China refers to as a small clique is actually American-led alliance, which involves the United States, Japan, Australia, and the Philippines. Yeah? We do not believe that such kind of so-called joint efforts, would actually help resolving this issue. Actually, it would make the South China Sea issue more volatile and difficult to be resolved.
The U.S. is not pushing the Philippines to defend its own rights, or Vietnam, or Indonesia, or Malaysia, or for that matter, Japan, or Taiwan, or India on the Himalayan border. Whatever new security arrangements and political arrangements are developing in the region are antibodies to Chinese bullying and coercion. And again, by trying to pretend that it doesn't have to meet its neighbors as equals, that the only thing that matters is talking to the US, China absolves itself of all responsibility for what's happening in the region.
Are you concerned that the Philippines could become a proxy for superpower rivalry?
The Philippines, I think, at the moment, feels very vulnerable in the current worsening and heightened state of US-China strategic competition and rivalry. For the Philippines, I think, it must ensure that its interests will not be compromised. It must not allow itself to be used by a superpower to promote its interests, but it must also not allow another superpower in undermining its national security and simply stating in the narrative that small powers have no agency and can't do anything in the international arena.